This table isn't yours, and neither is your power.
You need to leave, sir. Those 5 words hit the room like a dropped tray of glass. It wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, it was firm, clear, unapologetic. And it came from a waitress. Not just any waitress, her name was Nyla Monroe. 27, black, athletic build, radiant smile, the kind of presence that makes a whole room feel warmer. But in that moment, she wasn't smiling. She was standing at table 6 of the Crossline Café, a century-old eatery tucked inside Savannah's historic train station, staring straight into the eyes of a billionaire. Silas Mercer, tech mogul, worth $6.8 billion, used to people stepping aside. He didn't move. The diner went quiet, forks froze mid-air, phones tilted, somebody started filming. This wasn't just a seating dispute. This was a black story, a moment where dignity met power and didn't flinch. Silas blinked. "Excuse me?" His voice carried the kind of weight that usually ends conversations. Nyla didn't budge. "This table's reserved," she said, eyes locked. "And you need to leave." What happened next? It's the kind of story that stays with you not just because of what was said, but because of what was remembered. A daughter, a dying father. A seat that held more than a place to eat, it held history. And a CEO who thought he owned the building, only to learn he didn't understand the room. At Hidden Worth, we don't tell stories for clicks, we tell them for clarity, for justice you can feel, for moments like this when 5 words draw a line between ambition and humanity. So stay right where you are, because this black story isn't about revenge, it's about respect. And before it's over, you'll see why a single booth, in a modest train station diner, became the stage for a $200 million decision and a reckoning decades in the making. Don't just watch, witness. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. Before that Thursday night at Crossline Cafe turned into a showdown, there was a history behind every seat, every scar, and every silence in the room. Nyla Monroe wasn't just another waitress in a crisp white apron. She grew up just 5 blocks from the train station on Martin Street, behind the old textile mill. She lost both parents by age 12. Her mother, Delilah, had been a nurse. Her father, a railroad mechanic. After the accident that took them both, Nyla was raised by her Aunt Cecily, a former teacher who believed that dignity and education could still change a life. Nyla was bright, real bright. She graduated valedictorian from Monroe High, accepted to 2 state universities, but turned them down. Not because she wanted to, but because the money wasn't there. Instead, she took a job at the cafe where her mother once waited tables before nursing school. Every Thursday, she worked the same shift. Every Thursday, she made sure booth 6 stayed untouched, because booth 6 wasn't just any table. It was the spot where her parents met, where her mom announced her pregnancy, and where her father proposed with a promise, scrawled in grease pencil on a napkin, that he'd build her a life worth the waiting. That napkin is still framed, tucked behind the counter. Nyla's beauty wasn't just in how she looked, though people noticed. Clear skin, kind eyes, natural curls tied back neat, the walk of someone who knew how to carry herself. But what drew people in was something else, something steady, unshaken. The kind of confidence that's earned from surviving, not performing. Then there was Silas Mercer, 44, founder and CEO of Rhombus Labs, a billion-dollar tech firm that powered everything from digital ID software to predictive hiring platforms. His reputation? Brilliant, cold, efficient, a man who believed in logic over sentiment. He flew into Savannah that week to secure a $200 million investment deal with a Japanese group seeking to expand into the U.S. His team picked Crossline Cafe for the meeting. Rustic charm, Americana appeal. It was strategic. Silas didn't pick the booth for comfort, he picked it for optics. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that that one seat, in that one booth, meant more to someone than his entire company did to him. And she wasn't about to give it up, not even for a billionaire. Because some places hold stories, and some people protect them. That's who Nyla Monroe was, and she wasn't going to let booth 6 be erased. It started with a comment. Not a shout, not a slur, just 5 words, spoken under breath but aimed like a knife. "This place smells like history and poverty." Silas Mercer barely looked up from his phone when he said it. He was scanning his emails, finalizing last-minute details for the upcoming investor meeting. A soft jazz track played overhead, mingling with the clink of forks and the soft hum of ceiling fans. But for Nyla Monroe, the words landed louder than any alarm bell. She had just stepped out from behind the counter with a tray of clean glasses, catching the end of Silas's sentence as he waved a dismissive hand toward the exposed brick and vintage photos. She paused mid-step, her smile slipping for just a breath. Silas was seated in booth 6, the memory booth, the one that had been reserved every Thursday night for over 2 decades, the one marked Monroe Family Remembrance in gold script on the reservation chart, a chart he had seen and ignored. His assistant, Blake, shifted uncomfortably in the seat across from him. "Maybe we should pick another table," he muttered, glancing around. Silas didn't look up. "They'll make an exception. Everyone does." Nyla didn't approach right away. She placed the tray down at the service station, eyes forward, hands steady, but her chest was tight. She'd heard that kind of comment before, disguised as wit, wrapped in elitism, the kind that tried to turn community into decay, heritage into shame. But this place wasn't poverty, it was pride. Every photo on the wall had a name. Every seat had a story, including the one Silas had claimed like real estate. In the corner, Mr. Grady folded his newspaper, 82, widowed, veteran. He'd seen enough to know when a place was being dishonored. Without lifting his voice, he spoke toward no one in particular. "Some chairs, remember." It was just a whisper, but in a room that had suddenly gone still, it echoed. Nyla turned her head slightly. She met his gaze. He gave a slow, knowing nod. That moment, quiet as it was, marked the beginning of resistance, of reclaiming, of something bigger than one man and his money. Nyla didn't make a scene, not yet. But inside her, a line had been crossed, and once that line moved, so did everything else. Nyla had just refilled the sugar caddies when the second cut came. This one sharper than the first, not from Silas but from the men he brought with him. The investors arrived early. 2 of them, tall, dark suits, the kind of smiles that never reached the eyes. They stepped through the doors of Crossline Café with a casual confidence that said, "We don't plan to stay long." Blake jumped up to greet them, gesturing toward booth 6 like it was some private boardroom. Nyla watched from behind the counter. She wasn't eavesdropping. She was trained to notice tone, and this one had shifted. One of the investors, a lean man with salt and pepper hair and a sleek briefcase, sat down and glanced around the cafe. "This place is quaint," he said, dragging the word out like it had an aftertaste. His colleague, younger, American-born with a Tokyo education, leaned in and asked in a half-whisper, "Is she part of the experience?" They were looking at Nyla. The first man chuckled. "Ah, you mean the decor or the staff?" His laugh was dry. "Southern authenticity, I suppose." Then Silas joined in, not loud, but clear. Nyla's spine straightened. She wasn't surprised. She was disappointed. It wasn't the first time she'd been made into a prop. Not the first time her skin, her poise, her very presence had been used to flavor someone else's scene. But this table, this place wasn't a scene. It was a sanctuary. She turned her back to them and gripped the edge of the prep station. Her knuckles whitened, but her breathing stayed calm. From across the room, Mr. Grady shifted in his seat. He didn't say a word this time. He just folded his paper in half and set it aside. The cafe was no longer just a cafe. It was becoming a witness. Frank, the owner, emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. He looked toward Nyla, then toward booth 6. He could feel the shift. He'd seen it before, different faces, same disrespect. Nyla didn't walk over right away. She took her time. She checked on an elderly couple near the window. She delivered a slice of pecan pie to a teenager studying alone. But her eyes never left booth 6. The laughter had settled, but the sting of it still floated in the air. And now, it wasn't just about a comment. It was about a challenge. A decision was coming. And Nyla Monroe was already walking toward it. She approached the table like a tide, slow, steady, impossible to ignore. Nyla Monroe didn't carry a tray this time. No coffee refills, no menus. Just her clipboard, the corner of it worn smooth from years of use. Booth 6 had grown louder in the last 10 minutes, business jargon floating over half-eaten fries, acronyms tossed like darts, IPO, equity, scale. But when Nyla stopped at the edge of the table, the noise died. She stood tall. Her apron was still spotless. Her hands didn't shake. "Mr. Mercer," she said evenly, voice calm and unflinching. "I'm going to need you to move to another table." Silas blinked. He looked up from his phone with the half-amused expression of someone being interrupted at the wrong time by the wrong person. "Excuse me?" he said. Nyla didn't flinch. She pointed down at the clipboard, turning it toward him. "This booth," she said, tapping the name with her fingertip, "is reserved tonight, as it is every Thursday, for the Monroe family." Silas frowned. "I made a reservation." "Through your app?" "You did," she said, "and we seated you accordingly at table 4. You moved yourself here without asking, and I allowed that at first. I won't allow it now." The investors shifted. One cleared his throat, as if preparing to speak, but stopped. Silas glanced around the restaurant, his lips pressing into a line. "There are empty booths everywhere," he said, gesturing broadly. "This is ridiculous." Nyla paused, then spoke softly. "It might be ridiculous to you, sir, but this table has hosted my family's Thursday dinners for 22 years. It's where my parents sat on their first date, where my father proposed to my mother. It's where we celebrated birthdays, graduations, even my mother's retirement from Memorial Hospital." She took a breath. "And next Thursday, it's where we plan to gather after her funeral." Silence. No one spoke. Even Blake looked away. Nyla lowered the clipboard. "Tonight's the last Thursday we'll share with her while she's still physically in this room. So yes, there are other tables. For you, not for us." It wasn't said in anger, it was said in truth. And the kind of truth that doesn't move. Silas didn't speak. His fingers flexed on the table edge. His investors avoided eye contact. Behind the counter, Frank stood with his arms folded. And from the corner, Mr. Grady whispered again, just loud enough this time for even the air to catch it. "Some chairs, remember." For a moment, no one moved. It was that kind of silence, the heavy kind. The kind that wraps around a room like a closed door. Everyone in Crossline Café felt it. The couple by the window stopped mid-bite. The teenager with the pecan pie put down her fork. Even the jazz track playing overhead seemed to fade into the background. Silas Mercer adjusted his cufflinks. He wasn't used to being challenged. Not in public. Not by someone without a title, without a board seat, without a 7-figure salary. And certainly not by a black woman in an apron, standing in front of him with her chin held high and her voice still calm. He leaned back, glancing at the investors. One gave a weak shrug. Another looked down at the wood grain in the table, suddenly fascinated. That's when Frank stepped forward. Frank Rivers had owned Crossline Café since 1986. He'd watched 3 mayors come and go. He'd poured coffee for bus drivers, governors, and veterans alike. He didn't like scenes, but he liked disrespect even less. He wiped his hands on his apron, walked slowly toward the booth, and stood shoulder to shoulder with Nyla. "She's right," Frank said, his voice worn but unwavering. "That table's reserved, every Thursday. Been that way since her mother got her nursing pin." He turned to Silas. "I don't care what you built out west. I don't care how many zeros you have. In this place, we remember who built what matters." Silas opened his mouth, then closed it again. Phones were out now, discreetly but clearly. Customers holding them low, pretending not to film, but everyone was watching. The room had become a jury box, and every second he stayed seated, the silence pressed in harder. Frank took a breath. "You want another table? We'll get you coffee, pie, the works. But you don't sit there. Not tonight." There it was. The line, drawn not in anger, but in remembrance. Silas stood slowly, his movement stiff, deliberate. He straightened his blazer, but it didn't hold the power it had when he walked in. Nyla stepped back. Frank nodded once, and the room let out a breath it hadn't realized it was holding. No clapping, no cheers. Just respect, earned and held. And for the first time in years, Booth 6 felt exactly as it should have. Sacred. Silas didn't walk far. Just a few paces toward the back of the café, where the walls told stories better than any investor pitch ever could. The photos were black and white, most of them. Faces full of pride and wear, eyes that had seen decades roll through Savannah like the trains outside once did. Some pictures were framed, others laminated and thumbtacked, but all of them carried names that mattered here. And then he saw her. Second row from the top, center frame. A black woman in a crisp nurse's uniform, standing next to a rail worker in coveralls, both smiling, both holding a newborn wrapped in a white blanket. Delilah Monroe, 1968-2023. Below it, in hand-carved brass, was a small plaque, Seat of Service, reserved Thursdays. Silas stepped closer. He hadn't expected it to hit him, but it did. Something in her eyes, the posture, the sense of dignity that no hardship could erase. She looked like someone who built things. Not buildings, not apps, people, families, communities. Frank joined him at the wall. "That's Nyla's mother," he said quietly. "Worked 38 years at Memorial. Never missed a Thursday meal unless she was on night shift or someone else needed the booth more." He paused, and she never said no to that. Silas nodded slowly, absorbing more than he wanted to admit. "I didn't know." Frank gave him a look, not harsh but honest. "You didn't ask." Back at booth 6, Nyla was now setting down silverware with her aunt. Her hands moved with care, like she was dressing a wound, like she was setting a table for someone who might not be back again. Silas stood there, phone still in his hand. But for once, it didn't matter what it said. No notifications could interrupt this moment. No email could explain it away. He wasn't the main character here. Not anymore. Maybe he never had been. He looked at the plaque one more time. Not just the name, but the choice to honor it in public, where anyone could see, where it could be respected or ignored. Until someone chose differently. A seat wasn't just furniture. It was a memory held in wood, a life etched in routine, and sometimes a line that said, "This far, no further." Silas stepped away from the wall, this time slower, because now he saw it. And more importantly, he finally understood it. Silas returned to the front of the cafe with less posture than he came in with. His shoulders no longer led the way. He wasn't dragging his feet, but he wasn't rushing either. Nyla stood beside booth 6, now quietly placing 2 glasses of water at the head of the table. Her aunt and uncle had just arrived, her uncle leaning on a cane, her aunt carrying a folded shawl she always draped over the seat where Delilah used to sit. No one was looking at Silas, not anymore. But they were watching what he would choose next. The investors stood by the door, checking their watches, their body language tight. Blake was typing something into his phone, likely crafting a damage control email. None of it mattered now. Not in the way they thought it did. Silas turned to them. "We're moving the meeting," he said, quietly, but firm. Blake froze. "To where?" Silas looked at booth 4, the one he was supposed to be seated at from the beginning. It sat untouched, still polished, still waiting. "Right there," he said. "We'll take the corner table." He didn't ask. He didn't wait for agreement. And then, before walking away, he turned back to Nyla. His voice dropped, but every word carried. "I apologize," he said, eyes steady. "I thought I understood how to read a room. Turns out, I don't know much about rooms like this, or about people like your mother." Nyla nodded once, not with a smile, not with softness, but with something stronger: acknowledgement. Respect, returned because it had finally been earned. Silas walked to booth 4 and sat down. The investors followed, unsure, adjusting their ties like the temperature had changed. And maybe it had. Because across the room, Nyla's family took their seats at booth 6. Her uncle placed a small framed photo of Delilah at the center of the table. Her aunt reached over and straightened the salt shaker, just the way Delilah used to. The diner returned to motion, slowly. as if permission had been granted to exhale again. Silas didn't look at his phone. He looked at the people in the room, and for the first time in years, he realized maybe the biggest decisions don't happen behind closed doors or inside boardrooms. Maybe they happen at tables just like this one, in the presence of memory and the refusal to move aside for money. It didn't end with the apology. It never does. Because some moments don't stop when the diner closes or when the check is paid. They move, they stretch. They settle into places you don't expect, like inboxes, headlines, and family conversations at the dinner table. By the next morning, the video was everywhere. A 17-second clip, shaky but clear. Silas Mercer being asked to leave. The words were simple. The tone was unwavering. "You need to leave, sir." Millions watched it before breakfast. Some applauded, some argued, most paused, and for a moment, the world leaned in to listen to a story that wasn't about scandal but about standing firm. By noon, number seat of service was trending. Not because Nyla had posted anything. She hadn't. She was still at the café, wiping tables, topping off coffee, doing the same work she always had. But stories like hers don't stay quiet when they hit the right frequency. That afternoon, Rhombus Labs issued a press release. Short, direct. In honor of the service and legacy of Delilah Monroe, we are establishing the Monroe Healthcare Scholarship Fund, providing tuition and support for children of frontline workers across the country. Frank didn't say much about it, just nodded and added a new photo of Delilah on the cafe wall, this one in color, standing outside the diner, apron on, sunlight hitting her face just right. Nyla placed it beside the original photo. No ceremony, no speech, just a gentle press of the frame into the nail. Then she went back to work. 2 weeks later, the mayor stopped by. Then the local paper ran a piece titled, "The Table That Wouldn't Move." Then came the grant. Savannah's Historic Preservation Society awarded Crossline Cafe enough funding to maintain the site for another decade. Booth 6 would never be touched again. And still, Nyla didn't say much. She never tried to go viral. Never tried to chase the moment. She just kept Thursdays sacred. Every week, a new bouquet. Every week, fresh place settings. Sometimes her aunt came. Sometimes just her. Sometimes no one spoke. But Booth 6 was always ready. And if you asked her why, she'd only say this: some stories are meant to be protected. And the world, for once, seemed willing to listen. Frank handed her the keys on a Monday. He didn't make a big announcement. No confetti, no banner over the door. Just a ring of brass keys wrapped in a paper napkin, and a quiet sentence behind the counter. "It's your turn now." Nyla blinked. She thought he was joking. But Frank never joked about legacy. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I'll still be around, fixing pipes, yelling at suppliers. But I'm tired, Nyla. And this place, it already runs on your rhythm." He was right. Most of the staff already looked to her before making big decisions. Customers asked for her by name. Even the new hires called her Miss Nyla out of habit, like she owned the walls without ever needing to say so. She took the keys with both hands, like they were heavy, and in a way they were. She didn't celebrate right away. Instead, she cleaned Booth 6, polished the wood, replaced the fresh flowers, set out 2 place settings, one of which stayed untouched. Then she went to the chalkboard near the entrance and wrote something new. It wasn't a menu item. It wasn't a quote from a celebrity. It said, "Justice doesn't need a mic, just a seat." People took pictures, some cried, others nodded and sat down without a word. And every Thursday after that, Booth 6 stayed full with memory, with presence, with meaning. The business changed too. Frank made it official: Nyla Monroe, managing partner. She didn't raise prices, didn't rebrand, just added a line on every receipt. "Thank you for making space for stories that matter." More than that, she hired differently. She brought in a high schooler named Asha to shadow the kitchen team, hired a retired nurse as the new weekend manager, turned the cafe's back wall into a rotating gallery of community photos. People started coming in just to read them. But through all of it, Nyla stayed Nyla. Same neat apron, same tied-back curls, same quiet confidence that didn't need to be louder than anyone else in the room. She just kept showing up, week after week. And booth 6? Still reserved, still sacred, still waiting, in case someone new needed to be reminded of what dignity looks like when it takes a seat and refuses to move. Silas Mercer didn't disappear. He didn't go on an apology tour, didn't post a Notes app statement. He just got quiet. For a man who built his empire on volume earnings calls, power breakfasts, keynote stages, that silence was the loudest thing he'd ever done. 3 weeks after the Crossline incident, he stepped away from Rhombus Labs. No scandal, no press release, just a quiet change in the leadership roster and a single sentence in a quarterly shareholder letter. Stepping back to reassess what kind of legacy I want to leave. His team thought he was having a midlife crisis, but Silas wasn't unraveling. He was rebuilding. It started with Thursdays. At first, he stayed away. He didn't want to be seen. He didn't want to disrupt the rhythm. But he came, always in the afternoon, always quietly, sometimes just for coffee, sometimes for pie, and always at booth 4, never booth 6. He'd nod to Nyla, nothing more. She'd nod back. It was enough. One Thursday, he brought someone with him. A boy, maybe 10 years old. Curly hair, nervous hands. They didn't speak much, just sat side by side eating grilled cheese and splitting fries. Nyla noticed how the boy looked at Silas not with fear, but caution, like he was learning to trust. Weeks passed. Then came the check. A handwritten one, quietly placed in Frank's hands, enough to cover 5 years of scholarships under the Monroe Fund. No strings, no press. "Don't name anything after me," Silas had said. Frank just smiled. "You got it." But the biggest change wasn't the money. It was the way Silas started listening. He showed up at community board meetings, asked questions about sidewalks, school lunch gaps, bus routes. He stopped leading with numbers and started asking for names. People were slow to trust him. Rightly so. But trust grows in time, like anything that matters. One Thursday, Nyla caught him lingering near the café wall. He was staring at a photo of Delilah, her nursing badge clipped to her scrubs, arms crossed, smile relaxed. "You knew her?" he asked. Nyla nodded. "She raised me." Silas took a long breath. "She would have made a better CEO than me." Nyla tilted her head, just a little. "She did, just a different kind." That moment didn't make the news. But for Silas Mercer, it meant more than any headline ever had. Some seats are just furniture. Others hold weight. Not because of their shape or the view, but because of what they've carried. Laughter, loss, love, history, legacy. Booth 6 was never about the wood or the cushion. It was about a woman who showed up every Thursday, no matter how tired she was. Who made space for stories, for her family, for her community, even when the world outside didn't always return the favor. And when that seat was challenged, it wasn't just a moment of conflict, it was a mirror. It asked everyone watching, what do you protect? What do you honor? And what will you do when your comfort comes at the cost of someone else's sacred ground? Nyla never raised her voice. She never needed to. Because dignity doesn't shout, it doesn't demand attention, it just stands there, steady and waits to be recognized. And Silas? He learned what power really looks like. Not in earnings calls or market swings, but in eye contact. In listening, in moving over so someone else can stay seated. Because sometimes, the most revolutionary thing a person can do is sit. Sit in history, sit in community, sit in the uncomfortable truth that we all inherited a world built unevenly, and we all have a choice in how we move through it. So the next time you walk into a room, a meeting, a conversation, ask yourself, whose seat are you sitting in? And if someone asks you to move, don't argue. Look around, listen, learn, and then stand up, because real worth isn't found in what you claim. It's found in what you're willing to give back. This has been a Black Story, brought to you by Hidden Worth. If this story moved you, take a second to reflect on the seats you've occupied and the stories they were built on. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe for more narratives that refuse to look away, because justice isn't just an idea. It's a choice, made again and again and again. Timestamps and links below so you can revisit the moments that mattered. And if you're ever near Savannah, stop by Crossline Cafe. Booth 6 is still there. And it's still reserved.